Tusen tak. Tusen tak? I'm sorry, I'm really sorry, I don't speak Norwegian. And my English is very bad, but nevertheless, I hope that you will understand what I want to talk about, or what I want to tell you about Lohengrin. I called this lecture Simplicity, Knowledge and the Dream of Being an Artist, and I want to show it to you by showing you practical examples of theater productions in the last years, exactly 4 of Lohengrin, and also later by showing you some photos. You see here one of the beginning of the Lohengrin production I did with the stage director Johannes Erath, which will be shown in 2 weeks here in Oslo, and we are very proud. We produced that in Graz, and it's now coming to Oslo, and we feel very much honored to be invited here to you to do this in Norway. Generally, I see a two-folded focus of interpretation to Wagner's Lohengrin, which you will find in several productions of Lohengrin, and of course also in ours. The first and the strongest focus refers to the opposition of simplicity versus knowledge, enlightenment versus naive believing, a history of facts on one side and a fairy tale story of the other side. The second focus refers to the so-called artist's drama. This means the contradiction between reality and art, or the contradiction and tense of the longing of the artist of being loved as a human being, and the solitude that art itself demands and success in art may lead to. One who has nothing to do with the opera, namely Mick Jagger from the Stones, he put it in a phrase very simple, by a title, "Lonely at the Top." And that's the conflict of the artist who had big success. Wagner himself called Lohengrin eine romantische Oper, a romantic opera, and this is an issue worthwhile to discuss, since at least in German literature, Romanticism is not restricted to somehow Gothic elements. Taking seriously, a concept of romantic art explicitly asks for contradictions and ambiguities, experiments in form and style, and a general openness of meaning. Wagner's Lohengrin now is indeed a highly ambitious work, both in form and content, since it actually is a fairy tale framed by a history drama. The fairy tale is in the center of the plot. It is the love story of Elsa and Lohengrin and the intrigue against them by Ortrud and Friedrich von Telramund. Somehow, like a frame around this fairy tale story, we find the history drama telling us about the German king Heinrich I. In Germany we call him Heinrich der Vogler, fighting the Huns and defeating them in 933, a historic fact, which a lot of people think of as the beginning of the first united German Reich, since Heinrich, in Germany at least, is idolized for having unified the German tribes in this war. And this is exactly what the first scene in Lohengrin refers to when King Heinrich comes to Antwerp to collect troops. To let the fairy tale hero Lohengrin, now drawn by a swan, appear in the middle of what seems to be a historic setting creates the basic antagonism of the piece. The childish dream of a world full of wonder on one side, and the very hard and profane reality of our life on earth on the other side. The revolution of 1848 and 1849 in Germany, as well as in other European countries, as a result of the restoration after the defeat of Napoleon, was conceptualized in Germany in a national context, as it was in all other European bourgeois revolutions of that time too. The aim in Germany especially was to overcome an old social structure in a new national state, unifying all German countries by one social and economic system. since the feudal system long before, as well as the German landscape in the middle of the 19th century at Wagner's time, consisting of not less than 35 Königreiche, Großherzogtümer, Fürstentümer, etc. And this had led to an at least economically unbearable situation of too many states, each with their own boundaries and taxes. Therefore, the nationalist glorification of a German union at Wagner's time still refers to utopia. So this was not reached, this situation, and it was utopia, and thus it is somehow completely innocent at that time. This might serve as an apology for phrases like the necessary fight of the German sword against the hordes of the East, which are to be found, these sentences are to be found in the frame story in Wagner's Lohengrin, and which of course are completely unacceptable for us today. Unacceptable for us, especially as a German speaker, knowing of the Holocaust, knowing of the war, and knowing as well of Wagner's anti-Semitism himself. He was a very, very hard anti-Semite. These history drama elements in Lohengrin also seem responsible for the positive reception the opera found in the German Kaiserreich after 1871, for which today the scene in the famous novel by Heinrich Mann, Der Untertan, a novel everybody should read, I can only recommend it, first published in 1914, in English known under the title Man of Straw or The Loyal Subject. For this glorification of Lohengrin, ironically, the scene in this novel is best known. Mann's novel namely shows the satiric portrait of Dietrich Hässling, that's the hero, as the clever but completely ignorant nationalist who attends a performance of Lohengrin and identifies himself a bit too much with this Germanism. Because of this mixture of a fairy tale and a history drama, Lohengrin comes from a world beyond into the hard reality of earthly life, which we record in what is called history. He appears by wonder. And actually in our production, he somehow literally carries the wonder with him. He comes into a world which could of course also be ours, since we could easily construct a direct line of historic events in Germany that leads from Heinrich der Vogler up to the situation today. And indeed, in our production, we wanted to give at least some hints to some of the periods between the world premiere of Lohengrin in 1850 and a 2 days Germany. And our focus doing this is always on somehow still innocent phase, in somehow innocent period, a political situation still before the catastrophe, with the guilt still to come. Therefore, we somehow refer to the period around the turn of the century after the Reichsgründung in 1871, with German imperialism and militarism at its highest point, but still before World War I. You see it, for instance, here, Friedrich von Telramund. Next is for us the years of the 1930s as the period of consolidation after the post-war turbulences of the 20s, now in the new German fascist state, but clearly before the war, before the Holocaust, and of course before the total defeat of Germany. The Olympic Games in Berlin in August 1936 could serve as the date. The special moment of the German defeat in 1945 also received a special ironic reference in the Graz performances by the projection of an iconographic photo showing the Red Army hissing the Soviet flag on the Reichstag in Berlin in May 45, which indeed was staged for film and photography only after the actual event had happened. The irony here lies in the fact that Lohengrin, in the end of Wagner's opera, makes a promise to König Heinrich, telling him, nach Deutschland sollen auch in fernsten Tagen des Ostens Horden siegreich nimmer ziehen, meaning, even in far future, the hordes of the East will never conquer Germany. From the perspective of Wagner's time and the following German imperialism, this promise seemed to have become a true and hard historic fact, which therefore supported the national myth. However, it was the Red Army coming from the east and not the Western Allies that took Berlin in 1945, so one could say Lohengrin has been proved a liar only in our modern secular age of the 20th century. Unfortunately, I have to say, this little scene is cut for the Oslo performances. This is a cut very often done in Lohengrin, the only one, for the singer's sake, so that we are quicker at the end, or maybe even for a political reason, or maybe for both. But we have to live with that, and I can't change it. The world Lohengrin brings with him has to be in opposition to real history, and for us this is symbolized by an imagery of art. Lohengrin, being himself a product of the arts, literally invites everybody in Antwerp into a space of art, into the white cube installation he brought with him, which is supposed to be recognized by the audience as a possible installation of contemporary art. The white cube seems to be filled with feathers behind a pane of glass, which on the real stage, of course, does not exist, so that Lohengrin is to be heard and can also descend out of this cube as if magically going through the glass pane onto the scene. The fairy tale characters. This is Elsa. In a fairy tale, she would be the princess looking for a husband, and Gottfried, her brother, turned into a swan by a witch. Ortrud, the witch itself, and Lohengrin, the foreign prince. These fairy tale characters are opposed to the historic characters, which is König Heinrich, der Heerrufer, and the soldiers and people of Saxonia and Brabant, with Friedrich von Telramund somehow in between these two groups. But surprisingly enough, it is Ortrud who seems most near to us today, since Ortrud shows a modern consciousness of rationalism and enlightenment. No wonder that Wagner himself, in a letter to Franz Liszt, characterized her, Ortrud, as a political woman. And for Wagner, a political woman is horrible, grauenhaft, gruesome, and frightening, and therefore disgusting, because a political woman, as he said, does not know love. I thought maybe we should ask your Prime Minister Anja Sölberg and our Chancellor Angela Merkel what they think about that. For me, Ortrud can be simply understood as someone who has read the works by Ludwig Feuerbach, which Wagner himself has indeed read and much admired. Feuerbach's key work, Das Wesen des Christentums, The Essence of Christianity, was published in 1841. It provides a general critique of religion and religiousness, arguing in a way that the human mind in developing religion has alienated or objectivated itself in the figure of God. So a human being mirrors himself in God, and God's love, in fact, is simply human love. The idea, to put it very simply, is that mankind has created God as its portrait, not the other way around as the Bible has it. Taking this as a background of our reading of Lohengrin, we can replace the antagonism between the old pagan gods Wodan and Freya. Ortrud tries to invoke in her big scene Entweihte Götter, desecrated gods. We have heard that, at least a little bit of it. And the new Christian God, all others believe in this antagonism to be more simply by the more general contrast between knowledge and versus faith, knowledge and faith of the other side, on the other side, enlightenment versus simple believing. The plot of the opera justifies this, since it states that Ortrud knows about Lohengrin's identity, or at least she pretends to know all his secrets, and persuades Telramund, her husband, to use this knowledge for their intrigue. This general antagonism directly refers then to our modern state of mind and our tragedy of our state of mind. Namely, the more we have to acknowledge the rational view of the world, the more we secretly and irrationally long for being saved and secured by a greater power that naive faith could offer us. But although Elsa seems to be a very strong believer in Lohengrin, she too has to suffer from this. She wants to stay in innocent simplicity, and she even promised to obey the command, but she cannot. It looks a bit like the forbidden door in Bluebird's castle, which is of course the more interesting for all of us because it is forbidden, and the same applies to the apple in paradise, forbidden by God to be consumed by Adam and Eve. We cannot resist to know. It is in our nature. And it is Elsa who shows this for us. We wanted to use this aspect in our production by placing the chorus in a mirror position to the audience, with the blinds at their eyes as a metaphor taken literally, which of course means blind faith. And that's exactly the situation you find here, which is the prelude situation. So it's the chorus facing in this way the audience. We originally even wanted to invite the audience to wear blinds themselves, and we wanted to give out blinds before the performances. So to invite the audience to try out how long one could stand to attend an opera performance without seeing it. But then the intendantin, a friend of mine, but she objected and she was a little bit afraid for the reactions of the audience, so we skipped that idea. Before the duel between Lohengrin as the defender of the accused Elsa and Telramund as the prosecutor, which all take as a Gottesgericht, a sentence by God, König Heinrich says a prayer in which he explicitly explains a voluntary self-restraint as the only possible solution of the conflict. And we heard exactly that in that wonderful, sweet, for me, very interesting Swedish version, the prayer in that lecture before. King Heinrich says, so hilf uns Gott zu dieser Frist, help us God to what we are up to, weil unsere Weisheit Einfalt ist, because our wisdom is simplicity. And of course, in the finest romantic manner, this too is highly ambiguous. Since we can take König Heinrich's word as an honest acknowledgement of man's simplicity and ignorance, meaning we really don't know anything. But we can take it also as the smartest advice ever possible for a human being, namely to submit deliberately and against our knowledge to blind believing. The use of the word Frist here, necessary for the rhyme, but very hard to translate, and normally in German language used in the sense of time limit or deadline. This use of the word Frist here can be taken as a typical example for how Wagner regularly treats German language. You know that he always wrote his libretto by his own. And he treats the language in pretending to refer to an older meaning of a word, which in fact does not exist and is mere fiction. However, since a German hearer can understand what is meant here by understanding the context, it therefore seems to be etymologically possible, and by this serves the illusion of an old and especially Germanic background and of historic truth. The different time periods our production refers to are indicated not only by the costumes, but also by allusions to art, like the romantic paintings by Caspar David Friedrich, you see an imitation here, or different kind of postmodern installations. Wagner himself suggested, this is why we do that, because Wagner himself suggested to see his opera Lohengrin as an artist drama, as the tragedy of the absolute artist, were his actual words. In the famous Mitteilung an meine Freunde, a letter to my friends in 1851, he explained Lohengrin's longing for becoming a human being and to be loved by a woman who is the human heart, as he says, or so for sure not the political woman he described. Since Lohengrin is a god, he is adored and admired only for this, which is not the normal human love between a man and a woman. And since Wagner here explicitly equals being a god with being an absolute artist, it becomes obvious that Wagner's Lohengrin is supposed to represent the artist as the lonesome genius divided from mankind by his ingenuity. And this image of the artist as the lonesome genius is exactly what European Romanticism invented during the 19th century, and which may be found in the paintings by Caspar David Friedrich as well as in the writings of the so-called German classics like late Goethe, which in a European context are to be understood as romantic authors. By this, Wagner's own interpretation of his opera Lohengrin can be seen as a part of a much bigger project of composing himself as the genius artist. A situation, however, Wagner could only dream of by the time he composed Lohengrin. He did not like the work as Kapellmeister, as conductor in Dresden very much. The Paris Tannhäuser reception before had been a catastrophe. He had no money, only debts as ever. His marriage with Minna was not at its best, and so on. But still, he visualized himself as the glorious artist, just like Elsa dreamt about Lohengrin before he actually arrives on the scene. I would like to compare this interpretation and its realization, at least briefly, with three other productions I know quite well. One is the rather old but famous production by Peter Konvichny as stage director we did in Hamburg, and I worked on it too in 1980. And the Berlin production by Stefan Heerm, you know, of course, opening in 2009, and this was exactly the time when I was head of the dramaturgy in Berlin, so I worked on this production too. And last but not least, a recently done production by Andreas Hommeke in Vienna and Zurich in September last year. In Peter Konvichny's Hamburg production of '98, we see the men chorus as schoolboys, later joined by the women as schoolgirls, playing innocently with wooden swords in a Wilhelminian classroom. This is a classroom typical for a German gymnasium, a school for boys until 1945, and of course after the wars these schools, which were not destroyed, served on, and I went to one of these typical schools too. This reminds us, these schoolboys playing with the wooden swords remind us of the war enthusiasm of 1940, and thus becomes a very fine allusion to the horrible development German nationalism took from the founding of the German Reich in 1871 up to World War II, including the Holocaust. And there are, of course, more of these allusions in Konvichny's production. For instance, the fact that Lohengrin appears there to be the only grown-up in this world, and also, and even more important, he seems to come from today, from our time. This actually means he is the only one who definitely is not innocent, simply because, like ourselves, he knows about the historic development of German nationalism and racism. Only in the very end of the production, Konvichny again gives an explicit hint to this kind of interpretation by showing Gottfried, the child who appears carrying a machine gun and a steel helmet. Stefan Heerheim's production of Lohengrin from 2009 in Berlin also highlights simplicity by showing the action as a kind of puppet theater show with the characters as marionettes. And of course, this perfectly fits to Stefan's typical style, since his production always have something of a puppet show, at least for me. For me personally, his production always reminds me a bit of these luxury children fairy tale books where you open a double page that broadly shows the entire inside of a castle, for instance, in which then you can fold down a little cardboard and which becomes the staircase, or you can pull a strip and the witch appears or the princess appears or something like that. No doubt that this style fits to the topic of simplicity as it alludes to children's game. But Stefan Herm also alludes to the artist drama, for instance, by wonderfully illustrating the prelude by a puppet on strings who looks like Wagner, dancing on a tree trunk and flying up into the ceiling exactly when the music indicates the Graal coming down. And by pretending later that Wagner himself is like God above, holding all these strings in his hands and therefore playing with himself. So the whole concept contradicts itself, leaving us in a confusion we cannot clear. Andreas Homolki, last but not least, only recently staged Lohengrin in Vienna and Zurich, and at least on the first side he focused only on simplicity, leaving the artist drama aside as well as the history drama, by showing Elsa's conflict as part of the daily life of a fictional community in the Alps, with very folkloristic elements. In this community, where obedience to simple rules is strictly demanded and elaborated knowledge is evil. And my colleague and friend Werner Hinze was Homolki's dramaturg, the very dramaturg who worked with Konvichny 16 years before in the Hamburg production. So no wonder that there is a kind of resemblance in the production concepts, which is most prominent in the set design. You will see that later. And by the way, for me personally, this is a good proof of the dramaturg's work and the importance we dramaturg have, although we are often neglected. This is, I will try to just briefly flip through these images. This is the beginning of ours. In the prelude, so you see these historic costumes, but Elsa, this is Elsa of course, has already a modern costume, and she's a bit like a dreamer. This, in comparison then, if you remember, this is our chorus in the first scene. This is what I told about Konvichny production. You see this classroom and the schoolboys and the wooden sword playing around. This then, in comparison, is the prelude of Andreas Homolki's staging in Zurich, which illustrates the history before the actual event, namely that the Herzog of Brabant died, and of course this is Elsa and this is Gottfried, who are at his funeral, so to speak. And this is the equivalent scene with the chorus. So you see, you can imagine a little village in the Alps, maybe around Zurich, where they play Lohengrin, or they take it seriously as that. This is the Gottesgericht, Lohengrin fighting Telramund. This is of course Telramund. And that's Stefan Herheim's prelude. Actually, this is a dancer, and he's as tall as me, and dancing on that tree trunk, and then in the prelude lifts up and flies to heaven. And this is Stefan Herheim himself for rehearsing, and this is King Heinrich von Schuljung. So this is what I talked about, typical Stefan Herheim production, where you can actually fold down things to become the set design, and you see the man above holding the strings so that the chorus appear to be marionettes. In comparison to this is the appearance of Elsa in our production, and this is the appearance of Elsa in Peter Konvichny's conduction in the schoolroom. Inga Nielsen in the cupboard, and she's called by the Heerhofer and King Heinrich to come to be accused. This is the wonder in our production. This is the white cube very big, and it appears the wonder is a very big set change. This is Lohengrin, this is King Heinrich, Elsa, and there you can see it pretends to be behind a glass pane, as you can find a kind of installation in a contemporary museum. Yeah. This is the equivalent appearance of Lohengrin in the Konvichny production. Perhaps you don't see it very well, but he has a modern, contemporary raincoat of our times, and this is of course Gottfried. He pretends to be the swan, and he comes from underneath like the wonder. This is the wonder in Andreas Homoky production, where she simply holds that swan puppet. And that's Klaus Florian Vogt as Lohengrin appearing in that Alp community. This is Elsa in Berlin. I put that because you see this is the Berlin production, although it's the wedding already, but you see this curtain system which comes from the ceiling and which is to pretend to be the Graal. So that's an image of the Graal coming down from above. This is our production shortly before the Gottesgericht. So the chorus is like us in our production, dressed first in simply black, contemporary black, and then when Lohengrin as first miraculously appears from inside this cube onto the stage, later the chorus enters the cube themselves, because they all want to become followers of Lohengrin. This is exactly where they swear to obey the laws of the Gottesgericht, and Friedrich von Telramund longs for the crown, and that is why he wants to do all that intrigue. And that's the equivalent scene in Konvichny's production, the prayer before the Gottesgericht. You surely see König Heinrich, Lohengrin, Elsa, Friedrich von Telramund, and Ortrud. She's not very well, but this is Ortrud. This is Ortrud in comparison in the Berlin production, and you see, maybe the photos, the computer is not good enough, but you can see all people on stage have a special dress which shows them as puppets made from wood. So you see this image, they are all wood, just puppets from wood. This is our cube, and now we are in the second act already, where you heard that Ortrud invokes the pagan gods, and then Elsa appears from the wedding, and she's above there, and this is Telramund underneath. So this is Ortrud, hier zu deinen Füßen, and Elsa above on the balcony. In our production, this is the cube, the piece of art. This is the same situation in the Konvichny Hamburg production with Telramund being here, and you see the whole thing in Konvichny is done by changement of the desks of the pupils. So this is the desk, and they change it even for the right room. So this is the same situation where the stage moves a little bit, and we see the staircase outside the classroom. This is in the classroom, and that is why Ortrud can ask her to let her in. So she opens then the classroom door to let her in. So Konvichny always takes the text very literally and then makes fun of it. This is the same situation in the Zurich production. There also the room stays completely the same the whole evening, which is exactly the same in the Lohengrin Hamburg production, not with us. And here, there's one that's also a little bit hard to see. There is one allusion in Andreas Homolki production to art, and this is this little picture here, where you find a very naive painting of two red hearts loving each other, which we can imagine simple people take as a good illustration of romantic love. This is, I took because this is a time reference in our production to the 30s, because this is a scene in a cafe. This is the in the second act, when the men chorus assemble and they read the newspapers and they read the historic newspapers. And of course, Simplicissimus is a very famous, has been a very famous critical, satirical newspaper in the 20s, which then the Nazis forbid, of course, later. This is the same scene in the Zurich production, where the men chorus assembles and they drink beer and sing like a chorus. And this is the comparison to the Berlin production, also with the men chorus and the Heerrufer. And this I like very much, because you see the wood. They're all, and look at their faces, because this is the chorus, the Berlin chorus, and I find them very authentically playing puppets. This is our production. You see Ortrud, a little bit like the 20s, 30s, and Elsa just before entering the cathedral, which they do here. So we took elements from the Caspar David Friedrich painting to replace the imagery of the cathedral, so they can enter in a way into the cathedral. And this is the same situation in the Konvichny production, where you have the cathedral only as the cardboard here, which actually shows the ground floor of the Antwerp Cathedral, so it's in a way the authentic. As I said, he always takes it literally and then makes fun of it, because he sets it into a strange setting. This is the situation in Zurich, or in the Alp community. The big scene where Elsa has her doubts and wonders if she shall ask the question. This is simply before, where you can see again the marionettes in the Berlin production. This is Ortrud also, and here Stefan Herm, he simply builds the cathedral behind as a painted thing, as cupboard. Look at this room, and you can remember all the records we heard, that they were supposed to look like that in real, and now this is an ironic version of it. Or look at König Heinrich's thing. This is in our production the prelude to the third act, and in which we illustrated, this is only orchestral music, but we illustrated the history before the events, when Elsa and Gottfried played in the forest, and Gottfried lost her, or she lost Gottfried by, I hope this is on the photo too, because Friedrich von Telramund wanted to love her, came to the sea, and the intrigue was done by Ortrud, who took the boy away. And this is in a way originally in the libretto, because it says that Ortrud turns Gottfried into a swan and let him disappear. This is the bride's room, the bridal chamber. So it mysteriously again appears on the stage. It comes from behind and turns around in that way. Before it's a mirror, and then suddenly it's a another version of this white cube as a part of contemporary art, with Elsa and Lohengrin already in there. So they're discussing, they have their big conflict, and you see the radio, which is maybe 40s or 50s, so we are again in the next time period. This is then Tellermann coming from outside, and the end of that scene when Lohengrin kills Tellermann. This is the bridal chamber in the Zurich production, where of course it is focused on that imagery. And what I told you about it's not on the photos, because the photos are always very close up to the scene, but the room, the old stage, is exactly the same as in the Hamburg production, because it is focused here on the picture, where in Hamburg it was focused on the blackboard, and it is focused by the desks of the pupils in Hamburg and by these tables in the Zurich production, so it's exactly the same. He wants to kill him, but he kills Tellermund, and that's the situation after the killing of Tellermund, so the change into the final scene, where we show that everything on the stage, this is our production, everything on the stage is theater, is art in a way. You see the real stage hands coming here and turning the trees down and bringing the bridal chamber on the side, and then the chorus appears from behind. So this is the chorus appearing from behind. Now they are in these white dresses. The dress designer Christian Lacroix, the famous Christian Lacroix, did the costume design for this. And King Heinrich appears again, and Lohengrin, of course, and there you see that Elsa is in her modern dress, like somehow like a desperate housewife or something like that. But now really desperate, because she has asked the question and she knows that they will go. This is the situation of the Gralserzählung, so he recounts he gives his identity to all of them. And this is the situation where he promises to King König Heinrich that never the horse of the East will come. And you see this picture of the Soviet flag there, and there's the Soviet soldiers hissing the flag, which then comes down, and we have that situation. The chorus gets rid of these white costume and redresses in their dress, in the dress they had before. And this is the same situation in Hamburg, so there's also a similarity, because in Hamburg then the classroom in the last scene has disappeared, and there's only this podest, the podium, and Lohengrin is there, and he disappears again by the trapdoor he has also used when he was coming in the first act. So that's the trapdoor in Hamburg with the light, and he moves down and disappears again the same way he came. And that's the situation in Berlin with König Heinrich and Elsa, so they stick to their puppets again. And this is Klaus Florian Vogt singing the Gralserzählung in Berlin. So you see, this is very much like the old photos we have of the real Bayreuth productions from Lohengrin, for instance, but now turned in a slightly ironic way. And the irony then, that's the final picture of the Berlin production. So the chorus, as in our production too, is again like us today, and we are in today. This is König Heinrich, and he shows that he has his own puppet with him, so he shows that this was all a game of puppets, of marionettes. This is the Graal, Lohengrin used to disappear again. And the same here is a game, a word game, because there are 3 opera houses in Berlin. One is the Komische Oper, one is the Deutsche Oper, and one is the Staatsoper. And the mayor of Berlin, Herr Wowereit, he's very famous in Germany because he's gay. And he once publicity announced it and said, yeah, I have to admit I am homosexual, I'm a gay person, und das ist auch gut so, which we can't translate, which means, and this is good for all of us, and that is why they quoted here a political statement. And so also in this production we came back to a situation of today. Thank you very much for listening.